الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه الطاهرين الغرر الميامين والصلاة والسلام على من تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. يقول جل شأنه: فلولا نفر من كل فرقة منهم طائفة ليتفقهوا في الدين ولينذروا قومهم إذا رجعوا إليهم لعلهم يحذرون. صدق الله العظيم ونحن على ذلك من الشاهدين والشاكرين والحمد لله رب العالمين. وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, we thank and praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for all of His blessings that He has bestowed upon us. We thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the blessing of Islam. وَكَفَى بِهَا النِّعْمَةِ Alhamdulillahi ala ni'matil Islam. We thank and praise Allah for the blessing of Islam, and it is sufficient as a blessing. We thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for making us from amongst the followers of His beloved Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam, who has said, مَن يُرِدِ اللَّهُ بِهِ خَيْرًا يُفَقِّهُ فِي الدِّينِ. If Allah wishes goodness for a person, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives that person understanding of Islam. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us such understanding. Alhamdulillah, by His grace, we are making our way through this all-important work, the seminal work of Imam al-Haramain, Abu al-Ma'ali al-Juwayni, that goes by the name of al-Waraqat. A few pages, but these few pages, though short in terms of volume, but voluminous in terms of its benefit. We have been reading through the Ahkam. Imam al-Haramain defines Ahkam, which is the plural of the word Hukam. Hukam is khitabullah al-muta'alliq bi-af'al al-mukallafin. It is the address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that relates to our actions, that relates to the actions of a morally responsible person. What is the number given to these rulings, these ahkam? Some scholars say there are 5, some say there are 7. That is the opinion of Imam al-Haramain, or rather the listing of Imam al-Haramain in as far as the Waraqat is concerned. Other scholars, they add azima and rukhsa, as we explained in a former lesson, and they bring the number to 9. So we have basically been looking at these ahkam. We've been taking them one by one and giving a definition for them. So this brings us to the definition of the term makruh. If you wanted to, and a person wanted to be pedantic, you would say that the actual address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referred to as karaha, that which makes something reprehensible. And that which it makes reprehensible, we give it the label, we give it the term makruh. But be it as it may, we will be using the term makruh to refer to the address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that relates to something, and the non-performance thereof is rewarded, whilst the performance thereof is not punished. So let's think of an example. Let's start, as opposed to the theory, let's start from the practical. The practical would be a person stands and passes water. Akramakumullah, a person stands and urinates. So this particular action, the performance of it does not bring about a punishment. The performance of it does not bring about a punishment. However, if a person, as opposed to standing and urinating, a person were to sit and urinate, its omittance brings about a reward. So a makruh act, if you avoid it, you get rewarded for it. However, if you do it, you will not get punished for it. So this brings us, and we can make our way now into the Waraqat bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the definition of the word makruh. So the text reads, وَالْمَكْرُوهُ وَمَا يُثَابُ عَلَى تَرْكِهِ وَلَا يُعَاقَبُ عَلَى فِعْلِهِ. So before we turn our attention to the translation provided here, let's look at the Arabic and let's break it down. وَالْمَكْرُوهُ, the word makruh, هُوَ مَا يُثَابُ, is that which rewarded عَلى تَرْكِهِ, for its omittance, upon omitting it, upon leaving it off. هُوَ مَا يُثَابُ عَلى تَرْكِهِ, a person is rewarded for omitting it. وَلَا يُعَاقَبُ عَلى فِعْلِهِ, very important, a person is not punished على فعله. So really, we're going to discuss this later, but وَلَا يُعَاقَبُ عَلى فعله, a person is not punished for perpetrating it. As opposed to a haram act, you will be rewarded for omitting it, and you will be punished for doing it. So we clearly see there that makruh distinguishes itself from haram. Before we go further, let's look at the translation provided here. Makruh is that whose non-performance is rewarded. In other words, if you don't do it, you'll be rewarded. And whose performance is not punished. If you go ahead and actually do it, you actually go ahead and you stand and urinate by way of example, then you will not be punished. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So there we have a good idea in terms of what makruh means technically. But let's take a step back and look at the same term. How are we going to look at it? From a purely literal point of view in order to give us a deeper understanding of this particular concept. So what does the term makruh literally mean? So our scholars explain to us and they say that makruh is the accusative noun of the verb kariha. So you and I who are familiar with Arabic, when we look at morphology and we look at the scales, kariya yakrahu karhan wa karahatan fahuwa karihun wa kuriha yukrahu karhan wa karahatan wa makruh. The accusative form of the noun is the word makruh. So makruh is in the accusative form of the noun, what we refer to basically as maf'ul bihi. Now, so a person, for example, would say, or you can formulate a sentence, or you read a sentence. The sentence is kariha shay, or you could say karihtu shay. What does it mean? A person would say karihtu shay when he deems something as ugly and repugnant. Look, we are only looking at the literal meaning of the word kariha yakrahu. So when we break it down, we say in terms of where is this word derived from? The root letters kaf, ra, ha, kariha. That brings us to the word makruh. It is the accusative form of the letters kariha. And then what does it mean when you employ the verb kariha? Karihtu shay, when you deem something as ugly or you deem something as repugnant. Now, the next issue we're going to be looking at, and you can understand here that something is repugnant, but not to the point that if you do it, you're going to be punished for it. If you omit it due to its reprehensiveness, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to reward you. But if you engage in it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to punish you. So there we see this correlation between the literal meaning of the word karaha on the one side and the technical meaning on the other side. The next issue we're going to do is that we sort of have a principle that reads al-ashya'u tu'rafu min adadiha. Things are known by its opposites. So we've looked at different concepts. We've looked at wajib, we've looked at haram, and then we've looked at the definitions and we find how is this different from, how is haram different from wajib? How is mandub different from mubah, by way of example. So now we're going to look at makruh, and we understand makruh to be that if you do it, you won't be punished. If you omit it, you'll be rewarded for it. Now we're going to juxtapose the term makruh to certain of the other ahkam to get a better understanding of the word makruh. So makruh distinguishes itself from wajib in that a makruh attracts a reward for omittance, whilst the omittance of a wajib is not rewarded, but rather punished. So the difference and the distinction between a makruh is very clear in how it distinguishes itself from a wajib. So makruh attracts a reward for omittance, whilst the omittance of a wajib is not rewarded but rather punished. So let's look at an example. Wajib. Right here on the southernmost tip of Africa, we are coming close to the time of Maghrib, within an hour or so. The ruling, the hukm of ada'u salat al-maghrib, of praying maghrib salah, what is the hukm? The hukm is that it is wajib, which means that if I do it, I'm going to get rewarded for it. I will be rewarded for it. If I omit, if I fail to pray the maghrib prayer, then omittance is going to draw a punishment. Now that is a wajib. Now I go back to a makruh. Makruh, if I do it, then I won't be punished for it. If I omit it, I'll be rewarded for it. So we find that makruh is on the one side of the equation, and wajib is on the other side of the equation. Wajib, if you omit it, you get punished. A makruh, if you omit it, if you don't do a makruh, you actually get rewarded for it. So they are opposites to one another from this particular perspective, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Now if we think along these lines and we go to the second part of the slide, it says the same applies to mandub and mubah, as omittance of the same is not rewarded. Look at a mandub. For example, using the toothstick is something which is rewarded, something deemed as mandub. If you do it, you will be rewarded. If you omit it, you won't be punished. Now what happens is the omittance of the miswak. Does it draw a reward? No, it doesn't. The omittance of a makruh draws a reward. The same applies to a mubah. A mubah is completely neutral, so it falls out of the equation completely, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. The next issue would also be that in terms of haram, how does makruh distinguish itself from a haram? For example, stealing is something which is deemed to be impermissible. It's not permissible for a person to steal. It is deemed in terms of a hukam shar'i, in terms of the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that relates to that particular action. The address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relates to the action of stealing and labels it as haram, which means what? That if you omit it, you'll be rewarded. If you do it, you're going to be punished. Now let's look at a makruh act. So haram, if you do it, you'll be punished. A makruh act, on the other hand, if you do it, despite the fact that it is considered reprehensible and repugnant from a very literal point of view, and even from a shari'i point of view, it's considered reprehensible. That's why it gets the label of makruh. But if you do it, you won't be punished for it. And that's the difference between a makruh and a haram. The performance of a makruh doesn't bring about a punishment. The performance of a haram act brings about a punishment. And this is basically what the author says in terms of Ibn al-Firqah. What does he say? Makruh distinguishes itself from haram in that performance of a makruh does not attract punishment, while the performance of a haram attracts a punishment, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. We go on to the next slide, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The scholars, Ibn al-Firqah here, he has raised certain objections to the definition given above about makruh. He says, and let's read through what he has to say. He says the definition is problematic, as the omittance of a makruh act is rewarded due to the intention of gaining closeness to Allah, not on mere omission. So what do we have here? We have the same discussion that we had in terms of haram. We said over there that haram is what? Ma yuthabu ala tarki. You get rewarded for omitting. Wa yu'aqabu ala fi'lihi. And you get punished for doing it. Now, when a person leaves off a haram act, is it the mere omittance that attracts a reward, or must he have an intention of gaining closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through his omittance? You have to have an intention of gaining closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through your omittance, and then that particular act is actually rewarded. Otherwise it is not rewarded, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So therefore, based on that particular objection, if you wanted to, Ibn al-Firqah, he gives an alternate definition. Now, our purpose behind this is not really to look at one definition and have an alternate definition, but to gain a better appreciation of the concept that we are discussing. Makruh is something that, on a spiritual point of view, we want to steer clear thereof. We do not want to be finding ourselves standing and urinating. But it's very important for us to understand the legal ruling thereof, and also to understand the classification thereof. So this alternate definition is not really only for mental gymnastic purposes, but to give us a better understanding and a better perspective. Perhaps it is that when we read the first definition, the issue wasn't as clear to us. So let's look at the alternate definition which Ibn al-Firqah prefers here. He says, وَمَا كَانَ تَرْكُ رَاجِحًا عَلَى فِعْلِي فِي نَظْرِ الشَّرْعِ. It is that which its non-performance, in other words, its omittance, rajihan, is preponderant ala fi'li, upon its omittance, fi nadri shari. In other words, from the shari perspective, he rather wants you to omit it, as opposed to him, Jalla Jalaluhu, wanting you to commit it. He rather wants you to omit it as opposed to you committing it, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. If I look at the definition, it doesn't really cover the issue of intention as well. I think that still features, but again, if you wanted to, this particular definition, huwa ma kana tarkuhu, its omittance, rajihan, is preferred by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as opposed to its omittance. So in other words, if you go to the lavatory and all things in order, in other words, there's no justification for you to stand as opposed to sitting. If you're going to sit, you're going to sully yourself. But if you're going to sit, you're not going to sully yourself. So what do you do in this particular instance? Think of what makruh is. Makruh is that, so you have a choice now to stand or to sit. The options in front of you, the real practical options in front of you, would be to stand or to sit. What do you do here? Think about the definition of makruh. And standing and urinating is considered to be makruh. So what does that mean? It means that not doing it is preponderant by Allah. In other words, Allah rather wants you not to do it as opposed to you doing it. which means that if you're going to do it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to punish you for it, but under all circumstances, it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who had rather wanted you not to do it, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So up until this point in time, we have covered 5 of the rulings, walillahi alhamd. We have looked at wajib, and we've looked at haram on the other side. We've looked at mandub, and now lastly we looked at makruh, and right in the middle we have looked at the concept of mubah, that which is religiously neutral. The last 2 that Imam al-Haramain lists here would be in the form of sahih and also in the form of batil. Something is sahih and something is batil. So we're going to now look at the definition of sahih bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then we're going to look at the definition of batil. May Allah grant you and I the understanding. So the definition of sahih, it reads as follows: وَالصَّحِيحُ ما يتعلق به النفوذ ويعتد به. Sahih, how do we define sahih? Sahih is defined as that which يتعلق به النفوذ, execution relates to it. In other words, it is executed, it is considered to be fulfilled, it is considered to be done, it is considered to be consummated. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. وَالصَّحِيحُ مَا يَتَعَلَّقُ بِالنُّفُوذ. We will explain as we go along بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the examples will also facilitate further understanding. وَيُعْتَدُّ بِهِ, and it is counted. So if you wanted to, when we deem something as sahih, this is now just for conceptualization purposes. Let's look at the latter part of the definition, مَا يُعْتَدُّ بِهِ. And if we wanted to, we could just say الصَّحِيحُ مَا يُعْتَدُّ بِهِ. Sahih is that which is counted. So let's look at an example. A person gets married. However, there is no offer, there's no acceptance of the offer. There are no witnesses. There's no guardian to oversee the process. What are we going to say? We're going to say that this is not sahih. In other words, it is not counted. And there you have the definition of the word batil, because batil is the opposite of sahih. Alternatively, we conclude a marriage contract. So what do we have? We have the guardian present. We have the 2 witnesses. We have the offer, when we have the acceptance of the offer, and obviously we have the integrals in terms of the bride and the bridegroom. What are we going to say? هذا النكاح صحيح. This marriage is sahih. What do we mean thereby? It is counted. From a legal point of view, it is counted as valid. You can put a tick next to it. If we're going to say, for whatever reason, maybe one of the conditions have been found wanting, we're going to say, look, this is not counted. In other words, it is غير sahih. Okay, so now we have a good understanding in terms of what sahih means. وَمَا يَتَعَلَّقُ بِهِ النُّفُوذ وَيُعْتَدُّ بِهِ. It is counted and it is executed. In other words, it is considered to be done. It is considered to be consummated, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So to give us a better understanding, and this is why we have the shuruh and so forth, we're going to read into what Ibn al-Firqah has to say in this particular regard. So he gives like a sort of a wajhu tasmiyah. Why is the term sahih used to refer to something which is counted, something which is considered, something which gets a tick next to it? The word nufud was originally used to apply to arrows. When the arrow hits the target, which is the purpose of shooting in the first instance, it is expressed in Arabic as nafadha as-sahmu. Similarly, when a contract fulfills the objectives for which is what enacted, it is referred to as nufud. So let's just run through that again. You have an archer. So he aims for the target, he lets go of the arrow, and the arrow hits the target. Now, so the purpose of him shooting is to basically hit the target. So he hits the target. So now, when a contract is valid, it is like the archer that shoots and hits the target. In other words, it is counted. And if it's not valid, it's like a archer with an arrow, but it doesn't hit the target. So when a contract fulfills the objectives for which it was enacted, a marriage, a sale, etc. For example, I undertake a sale, I enact a sale with you. I sell you this microphone for 1,000 rands. I sell a microphone to you for 3,500 rands. And it's a valid sale. We have the form, we have the offer, we have the acceptance of the offer, we have the price that is fixed, we have a valid buyer, we have a valid seller. There's nothing that compromises, no undesirables from the Sharia perspective. We consider that particular contract to be sahih. In other words, sahih means the objective of the contract is realized. If it's not sahih, that means that the objective of that particular contract is not realized, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So I have it as the heading as objections to the definition. That should not be the heading. This is basically an extension of what we have mentioned before, so I'm going to be reading it from here bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When the objectives of a contract flow onto the contract, like when a sale results in ownership, when a marriage contract gives rise to the permissibility of conjugal relations, and when a khula gives rise to an irrevocable separation, it will be labeled as sahih and consequently counted. I now remember why actually they have objections to the definition. The objection really, and you could be a bit pedantic in this particular regard, because Ibn al-Firqah does raise an objection over here. But before we get to the objection, let's look at the examples that he has given here. He's given 3 examples, and they are very nice examples to think of. We enact a sale, and the sale gives rise to the objectives of the sale. What are we going to say? That particular sale is sahih. When it gives rise to its objectives, it is sahih. When it does not give rise to its objections, we're going to say that is fasid. So the example was a sale, a marriage. So what is the objective of a sale? Is that you become the owner of the goods that you purchase, and I become the owner of the price that you have paid. If those objectives are realized, then this particular sale is sahih. Like basically you hit the mark, like the archer with the arrow, he hits the mark. Likewise, the objective is achieved over here. Second example is I get married. So there's a marriage contract. If the marriage contract gives rise to its objectives, يترتب عليه آثاره, the consequences fall into place after the contract has been enacted. In other words, the objectives are achieved. Then what do we say? That is the sahih contract. What is the objective? There's many objectives in terms of a marriage contract, but one of the other objectives would be it's now permissible for me to have conjugal relations with my spouse, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. The next would be that the person enters into a khula arrangement with his wife. They basically separating, but she's paying for the separation. What are the consequences thereof? He becomes the owner of the money. She goes into her waiting period. If all of these objectives are realized, and then we consider that to be a sahih contract, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. The objection really here, and now I can comfortably turn to the slide because it's headed objections. The objection comes in the last part of the paragraph. It says, counting a contract is really the intent behind labeling it as sahih and considering it executed. With this in mind, it would have been best for Imam al-Haramain to have sufficed himself with one of the 2 expressions, as repetition is avoided in definitions, argues Ibn al-Firqah. So what's the point over there? Remember early on in the class, I defined sahih as ma yu'taddu bi, that which is counted. So Imam al-Haramain, in terms of his definition, what does he do? He says ma yata'allaku bi an-nufud wa yu'taddu bi. So he's basically, in terms of the definition, he's repeating himself. And so in other words, that which is executed and that which is counted, it's one and the same things. It's one and the same thing. And in terms of a definition, definitions are brief by its very nature. Brevity is the key rule. So Ibn al-Firqah takes exception to Imam al-Haramain by the fact that he has repeated himself. But his repetition, alhamdulillah, has availed us, so we're not going to be too particular about that. We continue bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And now we're going to look at the opposite of sahih, and this is going to bring us to basically the end of our lesson bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Very quickly, we're going to look at the term batil, and then in our next lesson bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we're going to be looking at terminologies as per explained in the Waraqat. So let's look to batil now very quickly. وَالْبَاطِل مَا لَا يَتَعَلَّقُ بِهِ النُّفُوذ وَلَا يُعْتَدُّ بِهِ. This is very simple to understand because it is the direct opposite of a sahih contract. So batil is ma la yuta'allaku bin nufud, that which execution does not relate to and it is not counted. So if you wanted to be very simple, you could simply say a batil transaction. A person gets married, you come afterwards and tell him, whoa brother, your nikah was batil. What does it mean? Your nikah was not counted. In other words, those benefits that build onto a valid contract, those benefits, there's no contract for it to be built upon because the contract was null and void in the first place. You have to redo your nikah. So then we would refer to that as batil, in other words, not counted. So batil is the opposite of sahih. That is very simple. The expression batala ash-shay'u. So again, we're going to look at the very literal meaning of the word batala. So we use the word batala ash-shay'u. A thing is batil, is employed when something is destroyed. You look at a dishwasher by way of example, or a camera or a microphone, it doesn't work all together. So what do I say? Batala shay. In other words, this microphone, it's supposed to project my voice, but it's not projecting my voice. So I say batala. So likewise, when you enter into a contract and the contract is batil, none is not going to reify any of the objectives of that particular contract. It's not going to reify any of those, and therefore it is referred to as batil. Since a batil phenomenon does not give rise to the objective, it is made to be like something that is destroyed, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. And we give the same 3 examples here. No, it's a bit different, but the same primary 3 issues in terms of a sale, a nikah, and a khula. So like a sale with a stipulated cool-off period of more than 3 days. So I sold this thing to you again, but then you said, look, give me a cool-off period of 18 days. So because of that particular condition, the contract is rendered null and void. I don't become the owner of the money that you paid, neither do you become the owner of the microphone. A marriage, a free lady gets married to a slave on condition that the slave is the bride money. That is not going to be valid, and therefore the contract is going to be referred to as a batil contract, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. A husband enters into a khula arrangement with his wife. That's all good and well, but his wife happens to be a minor, and a minor doesn't have a capacity to enter into a commercial contract, so that's not going to be valid. So these are batil contracts that do not bring about the objectives, and therefore it is not counted, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. In our next lesson, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we're going to be talking about the terminologies, like what is fiqh, what is ilm, and so forth, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Till we meet again, barakallahu feekum. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Please remember me in your du'as, barakallahu feekum. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.